going to hit record now. Thank you, Lois. I had to have somebody remind me to do that. I got my mind on too many things. So we are recording. Welcome to this TAD Talk on sleepwalking to fascism and what you use can do. We're originally going to have a presentation by the Amos Project, but we ended up with a conflict of schedules. And so this became a convenient thing for me to just pick up from where I sort of left off on the Sunday sermon this past week, talking about fascism and the future and trying to come up with how we come out of this understanding of what's happening in our society, and also building what I would call radical hope. And up front, I want to be clear about this, is that I don't see hope as a passive thing. Hope is an active thing. Just like faith is not just a statement of beliefs. Faith is putting your statement or your convictions into practice. And that's extremely important for us to realize. And that faith and hope together really demand action. There's nothing passive about either one of those if you're really going to take radical hope seriously. And so what we see in our society today is something that we never thought we would have to deal with, because we've always prided ourselves in living in a society that's dominated by a liberal democracy. And when I mean liberal democracy, all of the founders of our country saw themselves as liberals. It is a liberal democracy based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, that democracy is an evolutionary stage of culture and civilization, and it's an advancement over authoritarian and autocratic rules of monarchs, and it is a way to try to incorporate a broader sense of individual and collective ownership in how we run our country and our society. And what we're finding out is democracy in itself is a very fragile thing, and it's something that can easily be lost. And there are lots and lots of examples of how democracy has disappeared in this century and in the past century. And it's something that's a continual threat. And this is something I'll say toward the end of the formal part of the presentation. One of the sources I'm drawing from is a man by the name of Jason Stanley, and he said that fascism is always a temptation of humanity, because other forms of governance and self-governance itself is messy, it's complicated, and it's hard work. Fascism is an easy solution to the problems that democracies face. And we need to see it as that. It's a way for people to impose their will on someone else, and also to deal with thorny issues in a society. So having said that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to have a PowerPoint that, feel free to, this PowerPoint I can make available to people too, but if you want to take notes or whatever, feel free to. I'm sharing my screen right now, and I am going to activate this PowerPoint. I'm hoping, there it goes. And is that filling everyone's screen?
Yeah.
Can people see it? Okay. Sleepwalking to fascism and what you use can do. The term fascism itself is something that it's kind of interesting. It has its roots in a tradition that the city of Cincinnati was born out of. Here we have the statue downtown of Cincinnatus holding in his hand what was called in ancient Rome a fascist. And a fascist is a bundle of sticks. In Latin, the word fasci stands for bundle. Just like if you have plantar fasciitis, like I do, the bundle of tendons that is in the bottom of your feet have distortions, and it creates all kinds of problems for people who have that disorder. But fascia itself is a bundle, literally meaning a bundle. And the battle axe that Cincinnatus is holding there became a symbol of the Roman Republic, and it became a symbol of Roman patriotism. He Cincinnatus was um, a member of the Senate, and he was a patrician farmer who came to the rescue of his country to fight off the barbarian invasions. And for a while, he was the dictator of Rome, fighting the barbarians. At the end of the barbarian incursions, Cincinnatus chose to retire and return to his farm and to be a citizen of the Roman Republic again. And that became sort of a symbol for the United States of having the citizen soldier. And George Washington himself was seen as an example of a Cincinnatus type character, a patrician farmer who came to the aid of his country and helped to found a country and lead a revolution. But when he had finished with his service, he returned to his country estate, even though it was a slaveholding state, he returned to that and became a private citizen. And so there was an order of Cincinnatus that was founded by the officers of George Washington's um, officer corps. And they created this hereditary society that you could be a member of the officer corps or a descendant to be a member of the Order of Cincinnatus. And that's how many of the Revolutionary War soldiers were given land grants to come to different places. I'm going to be admitting a few more people here. To get land grants, and many Revolutionary War officers were given land grants here in Southwest Ohio. And they identified with this idea of the Order of Cincinnatus. Well, Congress pulled Washington aside and said, you know, you really shouldn't be a member of this Order of Cincinnatus because it's an aristocratic society that's being set up, and they're making you the president of this Order of Cincinnatus. We just had a revolution to overthrow an aristocracy, and here you're heading up an organization creating a new landed aristocracy. Do you want to be president of the United States, or do you want to be president of the Order of Cincinnatus? Washington rightly chose to be president of the United States, and he resigned from the Order of Cincinnatus. Well, the patrician farmers that founded certain sections of Cincinnati were outraged by that, and they renamed the city of Losantiville Cincinnati in order of Cincinnatus, in order to honor Cincinnatus. So anyway, that's sort of like our history connection to this symbol, this battle axe. Now, in the Roman Republic, when the fasci was passed around, the axe blade was taken out of it, and it was just a bundle of sticks to represent the fact that a nation is stronger when people join together and bond with each other, because a bundle of sticks is stronger than an individual stick. So that becomes a symbol for nationalism. And so it's a natural kind of thing that came out of Roman history. And lo and behold, let's see here. Why can't I? There we go. Benito Mussolini ends up taking this symbol and coining the term of fascism, taking this tradition that came out of the Roman republics of a unified national identity and mixing it with the extreme politics that he represented, which first and foremost was anti-socialist, anti-communist. It was a very conservative Catholic orientation. It was based on crony capitalism and this really bizarre notion of national purity and national identity. So it's an extreme nationalism that is infused with extreme right-wing politics. And he called his movement fascism. That's where the term comes from. And it caught hold. And it's fascinating to see some of the old uh, newsreel flicks of Mussolini and how he would posture himself. Mussolini himself was a trained journalist who became a political leader. He understood the power of media, and he understood the power of spectacle to build a notion of extreme nationalism. And that's how he was able to solidify Italian society after World War I in the early 20s and build this fascist uh, ideology that held Italy in its grips. And it wasn't too long after that that fascist movements spread all over Europe and also caught hold in Germany. Now, I'm drawing from this particular book, and I would recommend that anybody who really wants to seriously study this, this is one of the very first books you should pick up, because he is so clear and precise with his definitions and how he explains fascism. Jason Stanley himself is the son of Holocaust survivors. His family was able to get out of Germany early on in the Holocaust in 1939, and he has made it a point to study fascism ever since as an adult. And so I'm deeply indebted to him. And what I'm going to be talking about are things that basically come from his book, and then other things that I've observed along the way about how fascism works. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how fascism and fascist thinking infiltrates our own thinking about how to find solutions to problems in society. So what Jason Stanley does is he has 10 chapters in his book, and these are the 10 chapters. They're called the 10 Tactics of Fascism. The idea of a mythic past, the use of propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, hierarchy, victimhood, law and order, sexual anxiety, Sodom and Gomorrah, and Arbeit macht frei, the old German phrase that hung above Auschwitz, which says, work makes you free. And he says, these are individually, these do not make a fascist movement, but combined, they become the primary elements of a fascist movement. And you will find people latching on to certain aspects of each one of these tactics and using them for their own advantage. That doesn't necessarily mean that a person is fascist. It means that they're using a tactic of fascism to achieve a goal. But when you combine them all together, it almost becomes an ideology in itself, and it becomes the basis for how a movement could take over a society. So let's take a look at these one at a time. The mythic past. And as you can see here, I said it's a constant portrayal of the country in the present as being in a state of chaos, where lawlessness, immorality, incivility, and division are created by a common internal enemy or enemies. And you can see these tactics being used by conservative elements in our country. Even some liberal elements might even hearken to a mythical past and say, it was much better back then. And today our enemy is this, or these people, or that person. What Mussolini said, and he was really transparent about it, he said the idea of a mythic past, and he used the term mythic past because he said, we need to create a myth about who we are. That's more important than reality. He was very clear about that. He did not try to deceive people into saying that that what he was holding up as the mythical Italy actually existed, but it's the ideal he was striving for. Today, people actually talk about a mythical past. You can see that in the Make America Great Again slogan, saying that at one time we were great and now we are not great. And we are not great because we are being destroyed by internal enemies and external enemies. And these internal enemies are people who are not part of the dominant culture of our society. They're the ones that are tearing us apart. And sometimes the people who are tearing us apart are some of the institutions that we have in our society, like a free and independent press is the enemy of the people, according to former President Trump. He identified all of the independent press as enemies of the people. And only press that was friendly to him was a patriotic press that needed to exist. And the other thing that goes along with this mythic past is that if you're following a fascist program, it's in your interest to create chaos. If you've ever wondered why the extreme conservative elements of our national political leadership are doing things that seem nonsensical, the point is to create chaos, to say, our government isn't functioning. And the reason our government isn't functioning is because they're making it not function. They're creating the chaos at the border because they refuse to create a sensible immigration policy that is updated for the modern times. The more chaos there is, the greater their call for a strong man leader to solve all of our problems in an authoritarian fashion becomes the logical choice for people. That's why people like Jim Jordan, who sits in Congress, has no intention of ever passing legislation. It's why some of his own colleagues, namely even John Boehner, called him a legislative terrorist because he's not interested in building government. He's not interested in governance at all. He's interested in chaos and creating more chaos so that the only alternative that we can face is an authoritarian solution. And that has become the reason for existence for many of the extreme Freedom Caucus members of Congress, certain governors who are sowing chaos, all of that. That's part of what they're about. And it all fits into this mythic past. If we would go back to the way things were, and they never say when that was, but if we go back to that time when things were better, and we all know what that's a code word for, when Jim Crow laws existed and white people ruled supreme and didn't have anything challenged, we were a better country. Propaganda. Every social and political movement uses propaganda. But for a fascist propaganda focuses on good and evil, or good and enemy. And that's why an independent press is an enemy of good people. And they are the purveyors of false news or fake news. And then the other thing about propaganda, fascist propaganda, demands a certain kind of conformity in information. They seek to silence all other voices by labeling them as the enemy and saying there's only one truth, and that truth comes from our leader. And you find that time and again in the speeches that former President Trump will give, most particularly in recent times. I am the solution to all of your problems. I am your vindication. I am your retribution. I am the one that knows what the truth is. These other people are out to destroy us, and they are dividing us. I am not dividing us. I'm the one that's going to unify us because I have all the knowledge that's necessary to do it. That's what the propaganda does, and it reinforces itself through repetition. And when news outlets serve in fealty to a political leader, and do the bidding of that political leader, they advance that silencing of all other voices. And you can see that with Newsmax, you can see that with One America Network, you can see that with Fox News, you can see that even with something like the Daily Stormer, which is a fascist website that sees itself as they all see themselves in one way or another as an organ of this fascist movement. Anti-intellectualism. The focus of a fascist movement is on the charismatic leader or leaders, not on truth. Got to admit a couple more people here. When you can control all forms of media and education, you can convey this message that science and diversity of thought and multiple perspectives are all evil and that are the core problem in our society. A fascist leader wants uniformity of opinion, and they want to be the arbiter of what truth is. And therefore, they will attack science that questions certain policy, particularly if you're looking at environmental science. They raise the idea that there's doubt. They create what are called false equivalents, saying that creationism theory should be equivalent to evolutionary theory, so that we should insert the Bible into all of our science classrooms and say that they're of equal weight, and that Darwin might be right, but the fact that we only have a 4,000-year-old Earth, according to creationists, that's probably right too. And so they create this whole notion that intellectual pursuit is an evil, and it's a source of corruption in the society. And it's part of the reason why institutions of higher learning right now are being attacked. It's also why public schools are being attacked, because public schools are teaching multiple perspectives, they're teaching the scientific method, they're trying to work on issues of diversity so everybody is included and valued, and that's not something that a fascist movement wants. And so if you destroy public education so that people no longer can tell what's true or real, it's easier to manipulate those people. Which leads us to the idea of unreality. Unreality means truth is relative, except for when it comes from the mouth of the leader. And this whole notion of false equivalence wears down the idea of what is true. Is evolutionary theory or Darwinism true versus creationism? And so the other side of that coin is, not only is the leader the only source of truth, but if the leader is said to be lying, the leader alternately says everybody's lying. And so when no one can find truth, what the person who is able to speak the loudest and the most consistent becomes the truth, whether it's a lie or not. And so authoritarians will say everybody's got an agenda and they're lying. I'm the only one that doesn't have an agenda because I have the interests of the people and no one else does. And that's why you need to trust what I say. And then the lies that Winston Churchill had this really famous line that during World War II, and Trump has taken advantage of this. He said that the truth is so precious that it must be protected by an army of lies. And that was at a time when he was trying to marshal all the forces of England to fight Germany. Well, that line has come back to be a beacon for the Republican Party today. That the truth is so important that we do need to protect it by an army of lies, and only we have the truth. So if you start believing that there is no ultimate truth and stuff except for what the leader says, you know you're set up right away to for an authoritarian situation. Hierarchy. Now, according to Jason Stanley, this is the biggest lie at the core of fascism. And it is saying the way society is organized is the way it is ordained to be organized by God. They even cite the the chapter in Romans that says uh, all government is ordained of God. And so what they're saying is that the way society is organized is the way it's supposed to be because it's based on merit and superiority, natural superiority of certain people over certain other people. And so when anybody challenges that, then they become the problem. If you challenge white supremacy, you're the problem, not the white supremacist. If you challenge abled supremacy and saying disabled people need to have equal rights, you're the problem. And what this ultimately leads to is the next thing, victimhood. When you convince people that their privileged position in a society is earned, or that they deserve to be on top and everybody else deserves to be in the place that they're in, then anybody who challenges that is making you a victim. Equality is the threat to privilege. That's why affirmative action is being attacked. That's why civil rights of any stripe are being attacked. That's why historic truth about slavery is being attacked in public schools, because we don't want poor little white children to feel like they're victims or to feel bad about themselves. We also see that there's a great UU example that's been floating around in the past couple of years. There are some older white male UUs who are saying it is no longer possible to be a white male Unitarian Universalist because we are being banned. And they're part of a dissident group that's attacking don't like the idea that we have UUA leadership, a president, for instance, who is indigenous and African American and queer. They're saying that there will never, ever be a white man in charge of the UUA again, and that white men are going to become extinct inside the UUA. This is no different than Tucker Carlson's replacement theory about why immigrants are coming across the border, that is being a strategy of the Democratic Party to weaken white male privilege. And he lives it. He says it very clearly that way, that we are being replaced. That is also why the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia was saying Jews will not replace us. We are victims of equality, of a movement that is pushed for civil rights, and it's gone out of control. I can also give you a CPS example, and this is what I've shared with Ramona, because we heard Ramona let me know that Bill Seitz was going to be showing up at her school and installing the new Board of Education for career technical in the county. And I had an experience with Bill Seitz when he was speaking at Woodward High School on an education summit. And Governor Strickland's representative from education was there. Bill Seitz was there. I spoke for the teachers union, and there were a bunch of parents and students in the audience. And Eve Bolton had invited students from Wyoming High School, because they were part of her government class, to observe government in action and looking at public policy and education. Bill Seitz saw the opportunity to create division and to make those white Wyoming high school students feel like victims. He stopped everything he was doing, looked directly at the white students, and he said, "You know what, you students of Wyoming, these Black students in this auditorium are stealing from you. They are getting resources that you deserve and that they are not taking advantage of, and they are thieves. They are stealing from you. He was trying to get the Wyoming students to take the bait, a racist bait that said, because some resources that were coming to Cincinnati public schools weren't going to Wyoming, there was theft involved in this because the white people of Wyoming deserved more resources than the Black people of Cincinnati public schools. And he was trying to make them a victim. And he was calling himself a victim of educational policy that is trying to level the playing field. And he opposes the leveling of the playing field because he says that victimizes us white folks. So you can see how the hierarchy system and this notion of victimhood go hand in glove. And you can see that time and again at political rallies where extremists are leading those political rallies, and they're saying white people are a disappearing race, that we're going to be outnumbered in this society and we're going to be relegated to the past, and it's all going to be people of color ruling over us. We can't let that happen. A notion of law and order is also a point. Basically, law and order identifies who's legitimate and who is not legitimate in a society. By definition, if you are in America, if you are white and more likely male than female, you're going to be considered automatically law-abiding. If you are brown-skinned and if you speak Spanish as your first language, you are immediately going to be assumed to be breaking the law because you will be called an illegal person. Law and order ends up defining people as being legal or illegal. And it becomes part of the language of fascism to talk about illegal immigrants. No person can be illegal by definition, but that's what they want to say. A person can be in this country and not have proper documentation, but that doesn't make them an illegal human being. What happened in Nazi Germany was that Jews were declared illegal human beings. And once they were declared as illegal human beings, they had no right to exist. Once indigenous people in Ohio were called illegal human beings, it was then legal to kill them and bring their scalp to government authorities and get a payment for it, because their very existence was illegal. This is what law and order means in a fascist system, and how law and order can be used to create this kind of uniform, monochrome kind of society that erases all people who don't fit the mold. You can see this example coming into being in India, where what the government of Narendra Modi is doing in India right now is that they're experimenting with different levels of citizenship. And the only way that you can be granted full citizenship rights is if you are a Hindu. If you are a Christian, if you are a Parsi, or if you are Muslim, you can get a form of citizenship, but it will not be full citizenship. So you cannot participate in the society in the same way that a Hindu can. It's a similar thing that happens in Israel with non-Jewish people, particularly in the West Bank. They have absolutely no rights that are equivalent to Jewish rights. So Israel is using that same technique. In Myanmar, the ruling military junta declared the Rohingya people illegal and made their very existence illegal, and they tried to eradicate them. And they even did that by erasing their history, taking their history completely out of the official histories of Myanmar, or Burma, if you would go back to its old name. So this notion of law and order is is full of code words, and it's full of ways to make the dominant group the only legitimate group in a society. The United States right now has, there are conservative members of Congress who are looking at the possibility of getting rid of birthright citizenship for people of color and saying, we don't want to have this anchor baby where an immigrant can come into our country and give birth to somebody and that person becomes a citizen. We don't think that's a legitimate way to get citizenship. So they are looking at the 14th Amendment that says anybody who is born in America is a birthright citizen. That is how citizenship was conferred upon the formerly enslaved people. They said, the 14th Amendment said, if you were born in the United States, you are a US citizen, and you can't take that citizenship away from them. And that's one of the reasons why the 14th Amendment was such a controversial amendment after the Civil War, because obviously the slave-holding South did not want to confer citizenship on people who were formerly enslaved. But that's how citizenship was conferred. So modern politicians are looking for a way to adjust that and redefine what citizenship is. That was one of the reasons why President Trump was going after the citizenship clause in the census count. He wanted to make sure that only citizens got counted. And then he wanted to have a limited definition of who is a citizen. And that's how the whole census count became terribly, terribly politicized during the 2020 census. So this was another tactic of an authoritarian personality trying to create an authoritarian system. An independent judiciary is a threat to fascism as well. One of the things that Netanyahu has tried to do in Israel is to take away the independent power of the judiciary in Israel. And that's what led to all these massive protests in the streets this past summer, where thousands upon thousands of Jewish residents of Israel were standing up and saying, we do not want our judiciary destroyed. And the reason Netanyahu wanted to do that is because he was facing criminal indictment and he wanted the judiciary to be subservient to the executive branch of government. In India, the same thing is happening. The judiciary is becoming more and more subservient to the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. In Hungary, the judiciary is not an independent body. It is subservient to Viktor Orban. In Poland, the judiciary, they're trying to whittle away the power of the judiciary in the same way. Same thing is happening in Turkey under Erdogan. And you can go to almost every authoritarian country in the world and you find one of the first things they try to do with law and order is make the judiciary system subservient to the executive branch of the government. And that was one of the fundamentals of what was written into our Constitution, because the founders of our country understood that the legal system needed to be independent and set aside from the political system, and that we would be a nation of law, not a nation of caprice, according to a leader. And this is also why President Trump saw his duty to transform the judiciary to appoint judges who would be loyal to him. And he always said, it's a loyalty test. I'm appointing you to this federal bench because you are to be loyal to me, not an independent judge. And he got that passed through with the judge that's overseeing his case in Florida, and she is continually to rule in his favor, postponing his trial till after the election in the hopes that he can actually eliminate any charges against himself. And he's got a dependent judiciary system that's working in his favor to do that. Sexual anxiety. In an authoritarian society, women and children are always under threat, and they need strong men to defend them. So issues of sexual identity, whether you're transgender, whether you are gender neutral or non-binary, or anything that is different from the standard heterosexual cisgender orientation, is a threat to the foundations of the society. And they will point to that as the eroding of the moral values of a society, that these are immoral people practicing this and they don't have the right to do it. And that it's unfair that a transgender woman should be able to compete with natural biological women in sporting events. So it's an interesting thing how sexual anxiety works into this. It's also this notion that feminism is an enemy of fascism because women who make independent decisions about their own reproductive capabilities are a threat to male dominance in a society. This was a major aspect of Nazi Germany. Hitler was an anti-abortion activist, and he said that women were to become the breeders of the Third Reich. They were the ones that were going to populate the Third Reich and create the master race. And so any German woman who was part of the master race could never get an abortion. And anybody that taught birth control or that taught family planning of any sort was under attack in Germany. And they saw the feminist movement as that attempt to gain some equality for women, and women understood that part of the gateway to equality was that you're not to be burdened by continually being a baby factory, that you could never achieve equality in society if you have to give birth to 10 children and raise those children. The idea of a woman having control over her own body is an anathema to fascism. And that's why the anti-abortion movement is as strong as it is, and why extreme right-wing politicians see the issue of abortion as something to go to the floor, die on a hill about. It is that serious for them. This whole notion of sexual anxiety is also, there's a threat to what is manhood in fascist ideology, and it's a tactic of authoritarians that no one should question the masculinity of a leader. And all of this stuff starts to question the masculinity of the great leader. Trump fashions himself as that's why sexual predation in his background and in his persona is not necessarily seen as a negative. He sees himself as a sexual predator and is actually sort of proud of it because it shows his masculinity. It shows his maleness and his dominance over women. And so that's why he thinks that it's a ridiculous thing for people to go after him for being a sexual predator, because that's what he is. He's a virulent man and he needs to be that way. Sodom and Gomorrah. This is another core value of extreme fascism, and that is that we are constantly divided between rural and urban communities. Hardworking people are rural people, farm people. Lazy people are urban people. They are criminals. They're gaming society. They're the ones that are dealing the drugs. They're the ones that are breaking the laws. And so inner city or urban is just a code word for anybody that's marginalized. And the popularity of that song, Try That in a Small Town, I'm assuming most people understand that's a big thing going through country music today. They even played that song at one of the Republican debates, presidential debates in the fall. And basically, it takes images from the George Floyd protests and draws them completely out of context, and has a country and western singer standing in front of a courthouse where a lynching had taken place in the 1920s, said, if you try that in a small town, we're going to take care of you. And it's this whole notion that rural people are the only virtuous people, and that we need to purge the cities and all of urban life of the slime that lives there. And so this division of calling urban America Sodom and Gomorrah is built into this notion of fascism. And lastly, Arbeit macht frei. When you say that marginalized people are lazy, then the way to teach them how to work is put them in forced labor. This was the slogan that was above Auschwitz. And it was a forced labor camp before they were exterminated. And so the Nazis saw this as a way to say, we're teaching the Jews how to have a work ethic because they're just leeches, they're parasites on society, they're the ones that control the financial networks of our country. They don't do any real work. They don't work in factories. They're the ones that own the factories. They're the financiers. They're the ones that leech off of our society. So we need to teach them how to work. We're going to put them in concentration camps where we work them to death. The same attitude about labor unions, because they say labor unions protect lazy people. They celebrate laziness. And this is also another reason why the elderly, the disabled, and children were eliminated in Nazi Germany, because if they couldn't work and be productive members of society, then they were disposable and they needed to be exterminated. Now, one of the things that's happening right now in Arkansas and in Missouri and in Alabama is that child labor laws are being changed so that children as young as 12 years old can start working in meatpacking plants. Because according to Sarah Huckabee Sanders, children need to learn a work ethic, and we're coddling them if we don't let them work. And so we need to have them working the night shift in meatpacking plants and cleaning those meatpacking plants so that they're ready to run during the day. And it's another part of this whole thing of this notion that hardworking Americans need to teach lazy Americans what work is all about. And it's all built around that kind of mythology. Now, I talked about this at the very beginning. A fascist political tactic doesn't necessarily have to have a complete fascist ideology behind it. Sometimes it's just a political tactic that's used to silence someone or to get an advantage. And people are not necessarily fascists if they use one of these techniques or tactics. But as Stanley said, fascist thinking is contagious. It's the permanent temptation of humankind to find easy solutions to our problems. This quote, and I don't know if you can see it all, this quote was given by Reverend Cynthia Kingman in the Berry Street lecture in 2023, where she uses a lot of Jason Stanley's material to talk about fascism inside the Unitarian Universalist movement. And so I'll just read this so you can get it. Mainline churches taught and enforced the norms of the ruling class and race, what we sometimes call WASP culture. Suppression of conflict, fixation on sexuality, emphasis on control, including controlling bodies and emotions, and children and women. Non-involved hierarchical structure. Let's see, I've got to move this here. Norms involve hierarchical structures of power, discomfort with vulnerability, and anything that seems weak. And of course, a high emphasis on conformity. How close is this to fascism? How many fascist tactics have we said are just how we do things? And she was asking that question of Unitarian Universalists and saying, is this the way we roll? So that's the last slide in, I'm going to see if I can exit this. I'm going to stop sharing so I can bring us back together. And I realized it's 7:54, and I said that we were going to give people a chance to leave after an hour. And so what are your thoughts about this, and how there are things that we can do to be aware of fascism and fight it. But what I really want us to get to is, how do we find hope and how do we find faithful action when confronted with this kind of a world? Because this may happen to us.
Well, Tim, first of all, I think you've done a great job. This has been an excellent, excellent presentation. And, I think it definitely sets a call to action, which is difficult to do in today's society. But, how much longer can we put up with, this pernicious lack of leadership we have and expect, the world to turn out to be a better place for our grandchildren and their children? I mean, there has to be some comeuppance to what's going on or what's not going on. And I have absolutely no faith in our current leadership. So how do we turn that page?
Yeah. Any thoughts from anybody else? I can give some examples of where. Okay, go ahead, Doug.
Well, I want to thank you also, Tim. That was an incredible talk, and I loved all of the points, and there are so many examples in today's society that these points underline. I think there are a lot of organizations in our country right now that are actively opposing these efforts on the part of Christian nationalists, for example. And I think that it would behoove us as Unitarians to put as much weight as we can behind those organizations, possibly get not only financially involved, but involved helping to do their work. ACLU, for example, Freedom from Religion organization. There's just, on and on and on. Feminist groups, Planned Parenthood. There are hundreds of examples.
I can give a couple of UU examples that are very positive about how individual UU churches responded to fascist tactics that occurred in their cities. And I'll go to Portland, Oregon first. The first example, some of you will remember, her name just flew right out of my head. She was an interim minister in our church in the 1990s.
Marilyn Sewell.
Marilyn Sewell. Her name just flew right out of her head. She left our church and went to Portland, Oregon. And right at a time when she was coming into Portland, Oregon, that church was floundering. They were losing membership. It was one of the largest churches in the UUA. They were losing membership. It was an urban poor church right in the downtown of Portland. But she saw an opportunity, because one of the things that was going on in Oregon at that time was anti-gay legislation that was going to threaten the LGBTQ community. And this was like in the 90s. So this was way back when anti-gay legislation was really rampant, just on identity of homosexuality, not transgender or anything else. She decided that the best thing that their church could do was that they surrounded their church with rainbow ribbon. The church occupied an entire city block. So they took the parking meters or the telephone poles, whatever objects they could, they tied a solid rainbow ribbon completely around the entire city block and declared to the whole city that this was a hate-free zone. Within 5 years, the church had doubled its membership, and they were up to 1,000 members. And now that church has 1,500 members.
Hmm.
And it's one of the leading churches. It's the church where Bill Singford, who came out of our congregation, when he left the presidency of the UUA, he went to Portland, Oregon, to follow in the footsteps of what Marilyn Sewell had started in building a church of cultural resistance to what was happening in the larger community. Another example is the UU Church of Moscow, Idaho. The UU Church of Moscow, Idaho is definitely an isolated island in a sea of fascist ideology. Idaho is a captive state. They're entertaining the idea of the death penalty for any woman that gets an abortion. They're talking about 100 years imprisonment for any doctor who performs an abortion. They're talking about all kinds of things that are an anathema to UUs. Her church is flourishing. And the reason their church is flourishing is because they're taking their message to the streets, and their message of siding with love, essentially declaring themselves a hate-free zone as well, and witnessing to their neighbors and actually engaging with conservative neighbors who hold these views and getting to know them so that they mitigate the hate. And that might be a really good slogan, actually, mitigate hate. But the whole idea was that they're showing up in the world and engaging with their community, even when their community is hostile to who and what they are. There's this wonderful quote by Clarence Jordan, who was the founder of Koinonia Farm. And if you don't know what Koinonia Farm was, Koinonia Farm was an interracial community in America, outside of Americus, Georgia, very near where Jimmy Carter grew up. And there was an interracial farm. They started in the 1940s. Well, by the time of the civil rights movement got ramped up in the 50s, Koinonia Farm became a target of the Klan. And Clarence Jordan and everybody there stood firm. And one of his greatest lines was, "Fear is the paralysis of the soul that prevents us from walking." I'll say that again. Fear is the paralysis of the soul that prevents us from walking. And what he meant was he was going to live with his faith, and he called faith conviction put to action. And he never relented on what he was doing. They were bombed. They had machine gun fire into their buildings. Their people were beaten up, and they never gave up. And one of the things that came out of Koinonia was a little movement called Habitat for Humanity. And it captured the imagination of Jimmy Carter, and it captivated the imagination of everyone in Southern Georgia, who ultimately became friends with the interracial farm community, and they persevered that way. Now, one of the ways that UUs ended up supporting him was our church, actually, in the 1950s, participated in a campaign called Friends of Koinonia. And they sold pecans because they had huge pecan trees and a pecan orchard, and they sold chocolate. And they launched a marketing campaign to have a national distribution network because the Klan and the White Citizens Council had cut them off from all economic activity in Georgia. They couldn't get loans, they couldn't get insurance. So people from the outside raised money for them so they could stay alive. One of the things they did, they had a great sense of humor, was they put on the bags of peanuts a little slogan that said, "Help us ship the nuts out of Georgia." And Fritz Casey Leininger, who grew up UU and a member of our church, remembers when he was in his growing up in Columbus, they always had Koinonia nuts at their dinner table, and they ate pecans all the time, and they were helping shipping the nuts out of Georgia. But it was that kind of faithful action. It was creative thinking and it was courageous thinking.
Hmm.
And I realized that, you know, a lot of the people in our congregation are over the age of 70 and are not actually interested in being out on picket lines, but sometimes that's important. Other members of our congregation who are not can maybe be on the picket lines, but we do have resources that we can use to support the organizations that Doug talked about. We can educate ourselves, and we could make our church a hate-free zone. Paulette, I see your hand up, Paulette. Can you?
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to change the subject, but I had a question.
Sure.
So maybe this isn't the time to ask it, because I think everything you're saying is really helpful for the ground level for what can be done. But my question is, well, I'm asking if you could say a little bit more about the corporate interests in fascism, the money interest. It seems like all the things that you're looking at is how they manipulate people and, you know, sort of the tactics and everything. But what about the power behind it?
Yeah. Well, in my sermon on Sunday, I talked about how fascism is a product of late stage capitalism. Oh, we lost you, Paulette. So maybe she'll jump back in. Fascism is a product of late stage capitalism. And late stage capitalism, like I said on Sunday, is not the mom and pop business on the corner that is making a profit by selling things that they buy and being a service to the community and helping build the community. What we're talking about are big financial interests like Wall Street, hedge fund operators, private equity firms, big financial traders who make millions and billions of dollars just by trading currency on a currency exchange, who don't really do anything that contributes to the value of our economy. And those people are funding the conservative movement in America today. It was Jamie Dimon, who is the head of I think Morgan Stanley. He used to be the CEO of Goldman Sachs, but now he's at Morgan Stanley. They change seats very easily.
Morgan.
He is raising money for Nikki Haley right now. And he's raising money into the millions of dollars for her because he sees her as a soft form of fascism that he can get Wall Street to back. And he's made a pronouncement that he's organizing everybody he possibly can on Wall Street to back her presidential campaign. This whole notion that one of the things that happened for many people in hedge funds. Paulette's come back. Sorry about that, Paulette. You missed some of my explanation that this is fascism is also a product of late stage capitalism. Right now, in 2022, Americans for Tax Fairness did the calculations, and there was $8.5 trillion in capital gains that were realized by financiers in the United States that is not going to be taxed. These are capital gain, $8.5 trillion in untaxed profit, capital gains. And right now, in front of the Supreme Court is a case that will make it impossible for the Internal Revenue Service to ever attach tax to capital gains. And they're saying these capital gains aren't realized because we haven't sold these stocks, so therefore you shouldn't tax us. But what they end up doing, instead of paying themselves and instead of cashing in their capital gains and then having that income taxed, they're taking out loans to live on. And they're borrowing money from themselves. They're borrowing money from their friends' banks. They're getting decent low interest rates for this money, so they can borrow $5 million to live on this year. And then they pay that back with interest, and they don't have to pay taxes on any income. And in fact, they qualify for earned income tax credit because their taxable income is below the taxable limit, and they qualify for earned tax income credit. And so instead of paying taxes, they'll pay interest to their friends at their banks, and then they can write that interest off on any income they actually did get taxed on. And so they don't have to touch their capital gains. And right now there's $8.5 trillion in capital gains that these folks are sitting on. And 8.5 trillion is 1/4 of the national debt. Our national debt's 32 trillion. They're getting 8.5 trillion tax-free. That's how they're going hand in glove. And that's why they're funding people like Peter Thiel, who operates PayPal, and people who are engaged in other kind of hedge fund activities. They're working night and day to try to figure out how to shelter their income. And they're using the fascist politics to accomplish it. And they see a Trump presidency as something that's going to be to their benefit. So, yeah, I'm sorry you missed the early part of the explanation, Paulette.
Yeah.
But so getting involved in that, I think on the ground level, what we can do is we can make our church a hate-free zone. We could make our church a free speech zone. We could make our church a zone that supports immigrant dignity. We could make our church a zone that celebrates diversity of life, the diversity of sexual expression. There's all kinds of things that we could do that would change our consciousness and then also draw attention to what we're trying to do. And I would dare say that that kind of a church would grow in membership as well, just like they did in Portland, just like they're doing in Moscow. So it's 12 after 8. I don't know. I've spoken a lot, so I'm going to shut up and just let other people respond, or we decide that we've had enough tonight.
Well, Tim, we got a little bit of a challenge ahead of us, that's for sure.
Yeah, Doug?
I'm curious. I mean, and I've observed this over the years. The fascist way is always it seems to be a simple, tempting way. And you said Jason Stanley said that it's always tempting to lean towards fascism. And I guess that's in the sense that supposedly it's a quick, easy way to solve problems. Is that where he's coming from on that? And a lot of
It
people
is.
think, and I guess, and I'm trying to put together, people when they grow up in families, there's usually a person who is the king or the queen of the family, and their rule goes, and they kind of learn, or they go to a church that's very hierarchical or very paternalistic, and so they learn to take orders, and they learn to do as they're told to do, and people get in their heads that if people just did what they're supposed to do, there wouldn't be any problem. And since they don't, we've got to come down hard on them. We've got to tell women they've got to act this way. We tell men they've got to act that way. And on and on and on with all these fascist points. What's your take on on that simple way is.
Well, I think that it's true that it is a temptation of society to seek simple answers to complex problems.
Mhm.
We don't want to spend the time, partly because we've been as there was a famous book that was written about the media. We amuse ourselves to death. We're anesthetized by mass media so that we want simple solutions, and advertising has conditioned us to do that. Basically, what advertising does is create anxiety and say we've got a solution for your anxiety. If you're socially awkward, using this deodorant is going to make you less socially awkward and be outgoing. You know, we've got a problem here for you, and we've got the solution for your problem too. So we tend to look for simple, quick things because we're conditioned to do that. So I think there's that. But I also think that fascist politicians purposely create chaos to make things not function. The goal of the Republican Party has been to make government not function. And they've done a really good job of it. And then they can say, look, this is a crazy system. You can't expect it. You know, Ronald Reagan's line, I'm from the government, I've come to help you. That's the worst 5 words or whatever that anybody could hear. And saying, we want less government, not more government. Those kinds of things. And then they go out of their way to make government not function properly.
Right. Well, and Reagan said that the government was the problem. And I
Yeah.
think that's what started that whole ball rolling.
Right. And these people are not dumb. Marjorie Taylor Greene is not dumb. She knows what she's doing. She is sowing chaos
Yeah.
because chaos serves her interests.
Mhm.
And it serves the interests of the people who fund her campaign, who are those big money backers,
Right.
because they know that they can control what's going on. So being a people of faith in the middle of that, here's another example of what UUs can do and what UUs are doing. Part of the law and order thing, even when crime statistically is going down and the murder rate is going down, particularly in northern and urban areas, the murder rate is increasing in Second Amendment states like Mississippi and Texas and Alabama. It's not increasing in New York City or Ohio. But one of the things that's happening is there's a new emphasis on what policing is all about. And Cop City, which is a police training ground in Atlanta that's being built right now, is to train police officers in urban warfare. And it's the assumption that our urban environments are going to explode in the future, and we need police officers who are like soldiers trained in urban warfare. And these urban warfare training institutes or training academies are being the people who are hired as the faculty come from the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF in Israel, because they have been experimenting with ways of controlling populations in the West Bank. And they're teaching our police force how to do what they've done in the West Bank to Palestinians. The UUA at this last General Assembly passed an action of immediate witness that said, we need to do everything we can to support the activists opposing Cop City. There are 2 UUA ministers who've been assigned to go to Georgia, and they are working with the Cop City activists right now to try to stop this training ground from being built. The problem is, obviously, it's a huge problem, and it's only one of many training centers that are being developed around the country. And this one is unique because it's being built in a Black community outside of Atlanta. And it's also a forest that's going to be clear cut, and it's a climax forest. And the environmentalists are saying you're taking away green space from people, and you're putting a police training academy in the middle of a Black neighborhood and training police how to kill Black people. And so all of these things have been converging in Atlanta to fight Cop City. And the UUA, to its credit, passed this action of immediate witness, and we've sent resources there. So when we contribute to things like UU for Social Justice or the UUA itself or the UUSC, we're giving money to organizations that are helping to empower local communities to fight these kinds of things. The Unitarian Universalist Service Committee gives a lot of money to grassroots organizations. There is a group in Louisiana called the Lowlander Center, patterned after the Highlander Center in Tennessee, and it's dealing with people who are living next to the chemical plants in Louisiana. And they're organizing those communities to get those chemical plants to clean up their act and not do environmental damage to the estuaries that these people fish in and drink water from. And the UUSC has given them money and support so that they can organize themselves to be effective in fighting that. There's all kinds of examples like that. The UUSC is giving money to Pacific Islanders to fight global warming and the rising seawaters that are going to flood their islands. So there are lots of ways for us to be a part of what's going on, even if all we've got is money to give. The time's 8:20. What are people's thoughts? Well, the silence is speaking volumes.
I need to leave.
Yeah. Well, I think we should probably, obviously, this is a continuing conversation.
Yeah, there's a lot to absorb.
It is. And yeah, I didn't expect us to come up with a lot of answers tonight, but it's a consciousness raising as much as anything else right now.
Well, it was excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great job, Tim. Excellent.
I agree. Let's keep saying the F word, at least that.
Right.
Right. That effort.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah,
All right,
Tim.
thank you, Tim.